Leilani, I don't know about you, but I know that myself and Irene both can fill time talking well, so we shouldn't have a problem making up for the fact that
Wonderful. I know it's going to go fast too. I was like an hour. Let's see if we can, keep it down.
Yeah.
Really
We've
excited to be
done.
joining y'all tonight. This is going to be a good conversation.
Yes.
Where's the countdown?
I have that we are live 30 seconds ago.
We are live. Okay.
Yeah, we are live. Hello, live world.
Hello.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Homer Shadowheart. I'm talking to you from Cincinnati, Ohio. It's great to see all your faces. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the land from which I am on and where the Greater Cincinnati Native American Coalition is based. As a step toward honoring the truth and achieving healing and reconciliation with those indigenous peoples who were affected most by the doctrines of discovery and broken treaties, the traditional Shawnee and Miami lands on which I am standing and on which the city of Cincinnati was built. Thank you for taking that moment with me. If we can go around and introduce ourselves, if we could please begin with Irene.
Hello, I'm Irene Bedard. I'm live from Los Angeles right now in Long Beach. I wanted to say happy Father's Day, and I'm glad to be here for this Juneteenth discussion. And I'm just really looking forward to hearing what Leilani has to discuss with us and what we can do to further this in a better way for all of us.
My name is Homer Shadowheart, as I said before. I am Susquehanna Anishinaabe. I am a member of the Greater Cincinnati Native American Coalition on the board. I am a comedian, an actor, a writer, musician, and the resident smartass of the Greater Cincinnati Native American Coalition.
That is true.
Yes, I love the transparency. Hey, well, yeah, definitely. Yat Leilani Clark Nakale Basachi, Kapoin, Dashache, Nakale, Dashanelli, and also my clan, Nanesh Teshe Tabaha. So and Biagandi, Navito Kapoinga Manu Napugan, it's my Pobi. So I just introduced myself in my native language of Navajo, Dene, and then also Chewa. So I'm born for Zuni Water's Edge clan and born also for the African American Nahamet. And then on my mother's side, I'm Kapawenge, Santa Clara Pueblo. And happy Juneteenth, everyone. Happy Father's Day and all those other parental guidances, spirits out there. I also, too, I'm actually a community organizer, a filmmaker, spoken word artist. It was the first time I was actually able to visit Cincinnati just last month. So I had a wonderful time at that community, able to share some poetry with Lila June Johnston, as well as with the Cincinnati Women's Choir. So that was really beautiful. Muse Women's Choir. Right now, I'm actually broadcasting live from Raleigh, North Carolina, so traditional land of the Lumbee Nation. And just really, but also, I mean, I'm a desert girl at heart. I was born and raised in Tucson, Arizona, the traditional territory of the O'odham people, Tohono. So very happy to join y'all tonight, bringing in also to that Bay energy. That's where my father's family has been from since the 1940s, and really excited to share more about that side of my lineage, like really embodying both African American and Native American, and just having these two journeys really coincide into a physical form. So this is my journey, and really excited to join y'all tonight.
Thank you very much. And again, everyone, thank you. And happy Juneteenth, happy Father's Day for those who that applies to. And welcome to our coffee house, our Juneteenth edition. This series was developed because we at GCNAC wanted to support and uplift the voices of our Afro-Indigenous relatives in a way that promotes dialogue and education. Today we're coming together over coffee or whatever you'd like to drink. I'm having lemonade. To talk about cultural appropriation, colorism, and belonging in the community as an Afro-Indigenous person, and how to support and have solidarity with our Black Native relatives. So let's ask this first. What does solidarity look like?
Okay, well, solidarity honestly looks like the
Throw that
space.
out to anyone.
Yeah, again, just the space right now that we're embodying. It's really has been a beautiful journey, especially since the amplification of Black Lives Matter. Since again, years worth of organizing that really reached its peak in 2020 and still rising up too. But I mean, it just put a lot of spotlights upon just the inherent anti-Blackness in this nation, and also too how it's also had its effects within other communities of color, Indigenous communities, POC folks. So really seeing though communities that don't have that same ancestry or descendants of slavery, but really having those methods to put down solidarity and like creating spaces like this where we can hear our own personal lived journeys as Afro-Indigenous folks. That's beautiful solidarity, and I'm seeing it more and more and more. This year I actually witnessed and was part of different conversations that took place, whether if it was African American History Month right now, we're bringing together this conversation in Indigenous space on Juneteenth. That's solidarity, making room for folks of these lived experiences and really working that we can bridge these communities closer and closer as we combat daily impacts of colonization, white supremacy, capitalism, and heteropatriarchy. How do those look in different spaces, such as Indigenous spaces and African American spaces, but also to combining those folks who walk in both worlds at the same time. So this is a solidarity in like living real time right now.
My wife is Black, and we were talking in 2020 for the first time in our relationship of how beautiful and tragic at the same time it was that we saw the Black community, the Native community, the Latino community, the Asian community, and even the white community banding together and saying, hey, this is wrong. And I think it brought us all closer together. And I hope it lasts, because it needs to. If we stand together, we can get way more accomplished than if, we try to do it. But again, it would have been great if we could have gotten there without the murders,
I think there's also this similar shared experiences and so many cross sections that we have. I mean, in the Miami Valley itself, when it was part of the Underground Railroad there, all the way up there, and when people saw that river, they knew they were free, and it's giving me goosebumps. And to have our communities and the cross sections, and I mean, it's a beautiful, colorful world, right? And we have so much rich culture to experience, and those experiences, though, have so many cross sections. I mean, if you go and think of what happened with Black Wall Street, and then the same kind of experiences that the Indigenous people were experiencing there in Oklahoma, with the murders that happened. And I think it's so important in this day and age to hold each other's hands and make that chain of our strengths and our beauties, and to share those stories of pain and suffering together, and know that that we have brothers and sisters, in arms together, in so many ways, in so many different levels of our histories and our shared collective experiences. It's so beautiful to know, to hear you speak your language. I'm a direct descendant of my mother went to the boarding schools, and it wasn't until she passed when I asked her twin sister about why my relatives would come from the village, and she would understand everything he said and then speak back to them in English. And I thought that it was because she was ashamed of our language, and when my mom's twin sister said no, she was just ashamed that she couldn't speak it well enough because it had been beaten out of her. And
Yeah.
I just think that there's so much that we're remembering now, and to hear you speak your language, to and I'm in Yupiak and Yupik on my mother's side, and my father was French Canadian and Cree. On when after World War One, because it wasn't a thing really. He took his wife and went out in the middle of Skowhegan, left French Quebecois, and and then his wife, his Cree wife, we only know her Christian name because it was, no, we don't do that. And the only way that we can do that is to go hide away. So there was always this experience growing up of not feeling like you belong in one place or another, but especially in that way of losing languages. And it's just so beautiful to hear you speak both your languages.
Thank you, Irene Kutla.
So how do you feel we can embody the strengths and weaknesses together of both cultures? Embody those strengths, those weaknesses,
Yeah, and I would say, I
so we
mean,
can learn
even in
from
terms
those.
of, oh, sorry about that. What was the last part, Homer? Sorry, there's a little catch.
I'm sorry. How we can embody the strengths and
Mm-hmm.
weaknesses of cultures, so we understand each other better, so we can learn from each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and I'd even like word it in a way where it's like I love to embody the fact that, I mean, as an African American woman, a Black woman, as a Native woman, it's like I carry within me generational trauma, but at the same time, I also carry within me generational resiliency. So it's really tapping into those two, like those both energies at the same time, recognizing what all the shoulders I stand upon, like both sides, both my Santa Clara, both my Dene, and then also too my African American, my Black side. I mean, I'm a child both from attempted genocide. Many people did not survive that genocide. I mean, right when we were brought over from the Atlantic slave trade, that was an act of massive genocide where we still have brothers and sisters and all in between, all those spirits that never made it across the Atlantic. That is a huge graveyard, and I feel that that's not something that is brushed upon too much, let alone in American history. I mean, US history, we are still coming to this crux where there's a huge conversation right now in critical race theory. I actually, being from Tucson, Arizona, I was actually really started my journey in activism when I was in high school. Tucson Unified School District was the first public school district in the nation that had public ethnic studies courses that was offered at the time, before the state of Arizona banned the program in 2010. That was like right after a bill that got signed that actually, because of my brown skin, I mean, originally I'm from Tucson, Arizona. That is a city about 86 miles north of the US-Mexico border. So growing up, born and raised in this area, that you feel this intense militarization of the southern border, you also have legally, pretty much not even condoned, but enforced racial profiling. And so you had this really just draconian, xenophobic legislation where I'm caught in the crossfires too, because I'm a brown person. Like nobody sees like on the outside, like, oh, you can't tell that I'm Black right away, Native American. Maybe you can from the curly hair, but when you come down to like just racist legislation, all they see is the color brown. So actually, I give a lot of my activism to the immigrant rights movement. I joined that at a young age. Also, the fight for access to cultural studies in Tucson. And before that time, though, I must say, though, like I'm also an urban native. Tucson is a very urban area. Again, the largest tribes around the area is Tohono. That's their traditional territory. Also, Dene, more from the north. It's a beautiful community of Yaqui community, Apache. So the Southwest, we are definitely have an influx of a lot of indigenous communities. Not so much, though, African American. I mean, it's a very different feeling when you're in the Southwest growing up as a Black person versus like when I went to the Midwest, when I went to Cincinnati, when I go to the East Coast. It's just like this vibrant, just how Irene was, that cross section where across the Ohio River, that was freedom too. So you have this beautiful intermeshings of this fight for freedom, for liberation from Black communities that I feel is just a lot more ties to solidarity, the Southwest, where there wasn't a lot of Black presence, let alone coming from a way, though, that also wasn't tied in with military and force. But growing up, though, I always felt like I was either just one or the other. When I'd visit my dad's family in the Bay Area, they're all in Northern California outside of San Francisco, a little community called Marin City. I would just feel I'm just Black. I'm just Black. I would just like start to like just talk and feel like, okay, I'm just Black, and then I'll put Native away in a box until I go back to that side later. And then the next summer, we're visiting my family out at Santa Clara. Our feast days every August 12th, and I would just feel like, okay, I'm just Native. I'm just Native right now. I even get like just start to be more with my res cousins, get a little res accent, and then later, but all my family's like, you're not just Native, you're not just Black. Like everybody knew that but me, but it was a beautiful journey to really come and embody both of those energies at the same time. A lot of that came with healing. I left Tucson for circumstances involving gender-based violence, and my one way that I could truly heal was like, it was the first time outside of my youth where I visited both of my families at the same time. I visited Santa Clara. I was there for a couple months with my family. I danced for the first time in ceremony for our feast days. And then afterwards, I also stayed with my family in the Bay Area for several months. And I was on both sides. I was able to hear stories of my lineage, my ancestors, my last name, everything that embodied me as a Black and Native woman. And now it's like when I go into the kiva, that's our churches where we go, where we dance and pray. You got to walk down a ladder. It's an underground church. And I dance, I'm practicing, and my hair gets fuzzy. Like, it's just like this beautiful crown of just Black curls. And I recognize I especially too, as a Bonner Clark girl from that side of my dad's family, I'm the first one in this space, in this te'i, in this kiva, to bring that energy here. When I go to the Bay Area, we actually have a street named after my last name, Clark. It's called Clark Way, in honor of my great uncle who started one of the first, it was the community-owned flea markets there. And I recognize, I'm like, you know what, Clark, that's my name right there. And that's also the presence of a Native woman. So it's really recognizing both of these roads at a cross points where, again, I draw onto that energy where I not only embody the trauma, so much that has been lost, but at the same time, so much that has been found by generational resiliency, and being able just to feel at home in my body, in my spirit, in my personhood, all at the same time, simultaneously.
So what do you think that journey of embodiment for Afro-Indigenous people looks like? What was your journey? I mean, you just told us about your journey, mm-hmm. and how comfortable you are now in being both of both worlds all the time. You think that's similar and I'm not asking you for an answer for everyone, obviously, but do you think that's a similar journey?
You know what? It's not similar at all. So much of us have such different journey. I mean, it's all very personalized, just as every Native person can't speak for another Native person, of course, too, even just like as a Black person, as a Native person, we all have our own, even to the extent of privilege, like me being able to go and learn some of my language, Tewa, Dene. Like we've also, I mean, my family on that side, of my mother's side, are all survivors too of the boarding school system that really, with intense violence placed upon children, lost a lot of that language. A lot of us too were actually, they were lost in the child welfare system. So it's just like we come from so much of these different avenues in life, with all of our personal circumstances based upon our lineage of people who had to survive intense circumstances that's really very fresh and new. I mean, I come from a state, Arizona, it just became a state in 1912. That's just like literally like almost just like a little over 100 years old. Even too, the fact that we're celebrating Juneteenth today, that the Texas finally got their act together and actually officially declared slavery ended. And that was on June 19th, 1865. A little bit after that, that's when my family first migrated out of Texas and went to the Bay Area in the 1940s during World War II. So it's just like we also live a very recent history, where we are not only just having to do a lot of remembering, we're having to do a lot of recreating as well. a lot of things of our culture that has been, again, cultural erasure, cultural genocide. A beautiful conversation that I was a part of this past March. It was the Dene Nachale series. And before, even too, just as Dene people, I mean, there was a term that's used and it's still used, but we're trying to recreate that. It's used for Black people and it's very offensive. We call it the Z word. We don't even like to use it. I mean, when you use that term, it's very offensive. So we actually are creating this name, Radmila Cody. She's an amazing Black Dene, beautiful woman that's a very beautiful performer, presenter, and she actually heard from, it was passed down from a medicine man and just someone in her family that's really well regarded. They passed down this term. A Dene practitioner created this term, nachale, and nach is like nach, those who come across. Hif, it's dark, it's calm, it's peaceful. It's those who have overcome and persevered and who we have come to like, and oneness. So even just a term like that, nachale, that's a new term that we are creating as Black Dene people. And this conversation is taking place in all sorts of Native tribes today. So I feel like just us embodying our different lived journeys is what's really creating these conversations today and roadways for us to be able to embody ourselves as Black and Native American people. Again, it was something that was very also calming and very reassuring in these conversations that I had in the spring, was like, I felt like I had to know everything. I'm like, oh my God, I got to read Bell Hooks and I got to read Vine Deloria Jr. and I got to be like both very like well read on topics of African American, on African diaspora and Native American history. And I'm like, you know what? What was said in that space was that these conversations are literally in their infancy, like just relations as Black, as Native people, let alone led by Black, Native, Afro-Indigenous folks. So these are, I mean, it's just seeds that are being planted right now. They're starting to take root, and I'm really excited for the future, like what's ahead. And all of us who are really living our journeys, who are able to document those journeys in whichever way, through art, through writing, through whichever platform that we want to actually solidify our stories and present our lived experiences, that is in itself is recreating history and lost, stolen words that our ancestors did not have the ability to speak in the past.
Thank you. So what lateral violence is happening in Afro-Indigenous communities around colorism?
That is a good question. So, I saw a lot, and also too. If anybody wants to jump in too, I would love to hear your input as well. Especially too, Homer, you were sharing that like with your wife's experiences, you all saw a lot of things that took place, especially within Black Lives Matter. So, do any of y'all want to contribute to that part too? What you all witnessed?
I think
the first
that.
time.
Oh, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay.
That's fine. I knew of colorism because my wife had told me about it, and personally, I had never experienced, even being light-skinned Native. I had never experienced, but she said it's pretty prevalent in the Black community. I'm like, that doesn't seem. I don't understand that. And I was working with a lady, another Black woman, who one day just said, "What color is your wife?" And I'm like, she's Black. I don't know how to answer that. She goes, "Well, yeah, but is she dark chocolate or milk chocolate?" And I'm like, why would you ask that? What difference does that make? And she goes, "Oh, it doesn't." You wouldn't have asked the question. What difference does it make? Oh, never mind. And I thought, I don't understand, you know. And it's a point of, I guess, blissful ignorance for me, because I just don't recognize people by what tone their skin is. I recognize them by who they are. You know, if you're a good person to me, okay, you're a good person. I don't care, you know. So it's that's I kind of stopped talking to that person. We were kind of friends until that moment. I just kind of went, I probably don't need to talk to you anymore. And that was the first real experience I had with it. It wasn't really violence, but it was definitely uncomfortable. You know, I guess it was a violent in a vocal way, more of an attack vocally, but I didn't like it. I know that, and I want to make sure that no one in my family ever does that, because it's not comfortable, first and foremost. And I'm just speaking from my perspective and what I've experienced. And personally, if you say something bad about my wife, I'm probably going to, go very Will Smith on you. But um, but that's my real, experience with it, and my only real experience with it.
So one thing
Say something.
oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. One of the things that I always like to bring up or talk about is that when you look at, humankind, right? We all at one point were indigenous. We all had drums, songs, stories, relationship to the earth, relationship to our elders. We had, I am the love of 1,000 ancestors, Maya Angelou says. And so it's just that for our communities, so much of it has been stripped away. And for the African American community, that was not only stripped away, but made to just be forgotten in every way, shape, or form. And so that remembering of what we as communities together and those shared experiences is part of our deep time relationship. And getting to be able to come back and have those kinds of understanding of that what I do today affects generations to come. I am the love of so many before me. My name Gudairuk. We are given our names even before we're born. And we're generally given those names by our grandparents. And those names generally come from someone and their grandparents. So it is that link that goes back. But it's also a form of reincarnation where you take on the responsibilities and the moving forward of the story of that name in your lifetime. And so there's that true connection. And what has happened to both of our particular communities is, as you said, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the assimilation program. They literally, I've said in the past that just my very existence is an act of revolution, is a revolutionary act, because we're not supposed to be here. That we were meant to be wiped out, and so many of our communities are remembering those traditions, but also the realization that so many of us had to go underground to even practice our own, spirituality and who we are and what our understandings. And then the lateral violence, as we said, of this giant prison industrial complex, and, what the gerrymandering that's happening now. I mean, it's still a continuing experience. And I'm just glad we're having this conversation. It's really good.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you both. Yeah, for your insight. I know it's very, I mean, words do hurt, and just what Homer, just your experience with, just again too, like some folks being like, that's just a joke, dark chocolate and milk chocolate. It's like, still it's really rooted at the end of the day in anti-blackness, where when we look and pick apart the system of white supremacy, something, I mean, all of our routes, I mean, our cultural roots have had to deal with. It was everything seen as not white was automatically inferior. And that's seriously everything that has justified our institutional system, our institutions, education, government, politics, I mean, economics, all of that is based upon this privilege where if you are in closer proximity to whiteness, you're seen as more acceptable. And then how, let alone you have more access to material wealth, you have more access to to justice even. So it's so many things along the line. Again, we can talk about like racism and those systems that really work with white supremacy. But when you break it down with how much it has impacted cultural levels, that's like, it's just so insidious when you're also starting to feel those hurtful words and hurtful attitudes and plays into stereotypes when it's coming from our own people, from our own spaces. And I mean, just as too, like we really do have to. So lateral violence too is just like when we are starting to like divide and conquer, when people are really attacking each other. Like you do have the case where Black people can be upholding colonization, and then at the same time, you have indigenous communities that can uphold anti-Blackness, and that is something where we're starting, where we feel these intense pressures and in that way really systems that are upholding this violence when it's felt upon our own people. Like we really have to make spaces where we not only check that, but we also start to make it a cultural norm to eradicate those from our spaces. Because at the end of the day, when you're starting to just fight each other from the side, we're not looking at who's on top of that structure, and that's always going to be people that are in control of white supremacy. So at the end of the day, I mean, really recognizing where that's coming from, why it's there. And there was actually a good, so that's in a lot of these conversations, again, we're talking about with Black Lives Matter. What I saw in terms of lateral violence was like when Black Lives Matter was really amplifying in the summer of 2020, spring of 2020, I was also seeing a lot of just hurtful messages like on social media within Indigenous only spaces where folks are being like, oh, they're so violent, and well, why aren't people talking about this and this, and just like playing into like a lot what white typical US media was regurgitating, and really going along with that, but adding their own taste of like, oh, well, that's not that's not this, that's not that. And where you start to really pick apart though, like how much those cultural attitudes of again, anti-Blackness, where the further you are away from white quote unquote purity of all these different notions that really have allowed for whiteness to be held as superior and all else under that, we really do have to come to terms with like at the end of that spectrum is Blackness. So right when you start to cater into anti-Blackness, and again, colorism, getting back to that spectrum where the more darker you are, like how many folks and on this feed right now watching have heard from maybe their aunts or uncles or family members, oh, don't get into the sun, you're going to get too dark, or you're going to look Black, or you're going to like, automatically Blackness is seen as bad, it's seen as ugly. You can even look at, I mean, the Clark doll experience, the experiment from the 1954, which led to the school board of education, where that really led towards the breaking of segregation in the school system. You had these African American children which were shown Black and white dolls, and they're being told, pick the good doll. All of them picked white dolls. Like that is the sentiment that is given, and how it portrays to in Native American communities, like to be dark, to be on that darker spectrum is seen as a bad thing. So we need to, that's inherently rooted in anti-Blackness, where the farther you are away from whiteness, the further you are away from that, then instantly it's seen as ugly, it's seen as bad, it's seen as wrong. And that also includes like lack of access that many of us are given. That can be looking at who's in academia and who is not, when you're even looking in terms of colorism, like within our own spaces, let alone too as an experience of a Black and Native woman. So I feel like a lot of these conversations that came up in really ugly ways, I mean, it's also bringing forward spaces where I've seen like all Autumn-led community conversations that were internal, where they're like, we really got to dismantle anti-Blackness. I've seen now like Dene conversations at Dene College and in Navajo spaces being like, okay, we're not only going to talk about anti-Blackness, but we're going to not use a term anymore that's really was used to belittle Black people, let alone Black Navajos, Black Dene, and we're going to create our own terms. So we're all coming forward in our nude ways to approach this, and it really goes in just back to centering our values, who we are as Indigenous people. Like in Dene, we really are our culture is guided by ke, that's unity, that's family. It's guided by hoja, that's balance. In Tewa, that's that balance. And where in that spectrum, where in those deep cultural ideologies that is led forward in beauty, walking in beauty and balance, where does anti-Blackness fit in that? we're not taught that way. That's not from us. And that's also been a tool of white supremacy, really, again, just used for divide and conquer. So that's where like lateral violence is. And I feel, again, we're just having these conversations, starting to put words to these experiences in ways that we can start to combat these. And the first step is really bringing awareness about it and having spaces like this where we can openly talk about these things and really start to break and come in mind that we got to break a lot of habits that aren't our own and that we're taught in really bad ways to not help or benefit any of us.
Absolutely. You mentioned this a couple times, and this is a very loaded question, especially coming from a comic, so I will probably not answer this. What is white supremacy?
Ooh. Irene, you want to go for this one first, or?
Now, as a comic, I would say it's never existed because they've never been superior, but that's just as a comic, not here in this discussion.
Well, I mean, basically, it's about power and control. Having the the experience of growing up in Anchorage during the 70s when oil was discovered and the building of the Alaska Federation of Natives. We had those meetings in my basement and of our house, and our father got death threats, and for doing so. And during that time was a huge influx of people who worked in the oil industry, and the majority of them came from the Texas area, and the majority of them were, white, Caucasians. And my mother was thrown into a trash dump. We were chased with baseball bats pretty much on a daily basis. I was the oldest child and the oldest grandchild, so I would work it out so that we would run home to get away from that. And that's, as I mentioned, it's power and control. Having control of our resources, whether it's water or oil or gold, has always been part of the over prevailing desire to maintain the status quo. And so that's really, I think, to go further, the experiences of what happened when our Capitol being stormed. I'm as Native people, we have the highest per capita in the United States to join the military. I carry around a pocket constitution of the United States with me because it's the idealism that we are constantly working toward. We're constantly working toward. And the ideas of social justice, environmental justice, economic justice. Ultimately, if we have been so out of balance, and in a way, my friend Walt Puyer says that this is the age of the daughters, and it's not that he's talking about feminism. He's talking about balance. That for so much of America's history, of the history of the world, that it's been very patriarchal, and so many of our cultures are not that. We're matriarchal, and I think that you put all of that together, and really, it's maintaining that status quo. That's what it is. This and using the color of their skin to maintain that status quo. You said it so well, Leilani. I mean, really, that's as far as what is white supremacy. It's that violence and that anger, and And it's patriarchal, I think. So, but I think, that's not, of course, all of our brothers and sisters who are in those worlds and places. I mean, so many of the people I love and, honor are just, all along with us, just human beings, spirits on a human journey. And that is what we're working toward, is that sense that we can look at each other and see each other as spirits on a human journey, not, humans of a certain color.
Yeah, thank you both for your input on that. I just feel, yeah, that, again, it's a very large system to tackle, which again is very much embodied in so much other systems. I mean, just white supremacy, I mean, just its main function is this ideal of Western civilization where you give more favor to white, rich, male, cisgendered males. Again, I mean, our two spirit communities, both on African side and Native side, were the first to be persecuted when colonization first came to our areas. You have just this note, and let alone rich. So it's this system that keeps all of these just different institutions on certain guidelines and modes of function that you can always uphold that power structure, taking power away from other folks. So like extracting, how Irene, you were talking about the oil industry, water, like just the fact of how much has been taken from us. It's always in guiding and support and just really confiscated, being hoarded by just this one power structure that's such a little population in comparison to the rest of the world. So even right now, a lot of folks are actually moving away from the term people of color to people of the global majority, because at the end of the day, the majority of folks are not white, we're not rich, we're not cisgendered men, let alone Christian supremacy too. So this whole notion of white supremacy has these certain ideals that's very catered towards as well, just very, very evangelical Christian ideology. Looking back at when colonization first came to these shores on this side of the hemisphere, right when 1492 happened, the year right before, it was just the end of the 700-year war, where you actually had the Spanish had just had this huge war again for 700 years with the African Moors. So that brought this ideology where anything not Christian, anybody not white, you had that was brought this hatred. This was brought over to this side of the hemisphere. So it's always been rooted within this ideal that Black was bad, Black needed to be dominated, to be conquered, along with these wars that were primarily fought for resources, and looking at resources that also embodied human slavery. So again, the system of white supremacy, it's just the way that it's been used as a very violent way to steal the land of Indigenous people, as it's been used to steal physical people to exploit their labor. We look at the ways that white supremacy has manifested too within our communities. Is like a big thing that actually is a very interesting contrast and a correlation with each other is, for instance, blood quantum. When we're talking about more like just even Native American identities, like when you had the termination era, you had all these new qualifications, like what does it mean to be Native American? And you had this whole like these breakdowns of some tribes took it upon themselves. That, again, a lot of it was controlled by the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. That was, again, this really colonial rooted form of government that really broke us away from our traditional forms of government. And they were determining, if you are you have to be at least 1/16 Native American. You have to be at least 1/4 Native tribe in order for you to be considered Native American, for whatever tribe was going to be using this ability to put yourself as a tribal member in their census. And then on the flip side, you have the one drop rule, where if you were one drop African American, you're considered Black. And the way that formed and functioned to uphold white supremacy is that you take away Native population's ability to claim indigeneity. You now are like, okay, you're not Native anymore. We're going to take your land. These people, well, one drop rule, you're Black. We're going to use you as forced exploited labor for slavery. So it's just like all these different things that really bring about a lot of tension within our communities. At the end of the day, it's looking at the structure that's created this one, and who is it still upholding, and that's ultimately the structure of white supremacy. So that's always been an interesting way that I'd like to see like how that correlates with identities of Black people and Native people on this land.
Yeah, absolutely. Something I've always felt is that in the throes of being superior, quote unquote, they seem to like to appropriate from both cultures quite often. Um, and it's unique when it's simultaneously taken from both cultures. Should present at the intersection of the communities. You know, we've all seen the young lady with the dream catcher hanging in her car rearview mirror while wearing a dashiki, and she's or the background of the screen, but or notebook paper. Mm-hmm. How do we feel that the appropriation of both cultures is affect the communities? Irene?
How do I feel that I was thinking about this, when thinking about this today. I had a really lovely conversation with Jeffrey Wright on Westworld when I was working with him, and how he grew up. I don't quite remember the island that he grew up on, but the island itself is an incredible mix of the indigenous people and African American people, and integrated in a multi-generational way, and him talking about how because of that, like he felt because they were on this island and because those two cultures got to hold each other and have children together, and that he felt that he grew up in a much healthier world than we even exist in today. Than what's happening for us today, and I feel like we can either look at ourselves in all of the colors that we are and just be part of the fabric of American society, or we also have this tendency. I was working on with Perseverance Theater, which was just initiated an Indigenous play program. So they wanted each season to include an Indigenous play, and our art director basically said got into a lot of trouble because of it, because he ultimately was losing donors, long time donors, and he came to us right after a workshop that we were doing for the community to kind of give a better world and life, a training, I suppose, to the Alaska Native Indigenous cultures. Right after that, though, he had to come to us and say, well, because what we need to balance this, because we need to do at least one classic every year. And my sister-in-law, who's playwright there, she said, so what do you mean by when you say classics? And here's this very progressive person who's but it's that colonized mind that is always has to be worked on. And that's even with us, when we are growing up and having, as that code switching, here I'm working, in this kind of an organization, and then I go back home, and like you said, you go back home and there you are, oh, auntie, going right back to the ways that you like, well, where are we in that so that we can take ourselves out of that deeply ingrained colonized mind and bring us forward in all of our incredible, colorful languages and take out from hiding all of those traditions that had to go into hiding, all those spiritualities, all of those sacred, ceremonies, some of which, literally went underground. Many of the Pueblo communities not only have these incredible ceremonies that have to do with the Catholic Church, that in the churches that are there, but also have had and continue to have many ceremonies that you must be invited, or you must be tribal, and literally some of them underground. And the fact that we're still having to unlearn what we have been told generation after generation after generation, it's not going to be a simple thing, but we're moving in that right direction every day. As you said, how do we start this? Well, we started by doing exactly what we're doing right now. How do we open these conversations? And we ended up doing Our Town, but it was an Alaska Native Our Town. So, in that way, it was, still pressing on in that way. And so I think it's just an effort that takes daily practice for not only ourselves as individuals, but within our communities and within our communities around the world, globally even, that are suffering, so many of the things, same issues, problems that have to do with that global, as you said, that tiny percentage of the 1% who, are billionaires, and so many of the rest of the world can't even feed themselves. So yeah, we just are looking to find balance at this point. And I'm glad you brought that up, because it's for especially Clinkets though, but for us, it's one of our values. So is humor, so is humility, and just being able to take that breath and be kind to ourselves and our experiences, but then also have that perseverance, that resiliency, and can know that that's there, and move to instill that in our communities and our coming generations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for all those words just on having. Oh, yeah, for sure. Thank you.
What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. I mean, around cultural appropriation, even just the term like appropriation, it's like somebody is appropriating something to profit. So it's just at the end of the day, looking at who is profiting and who is marketing and making a lot of financial, who's benefiting financially from culture. And again, that's just such a gross thing. All the beautiful, just the sacredness of culture and our identity and our lineage that you were talking about, Irene. It's just like there's a lot of heinous ways that different markets and industries are really putting a price tag and really putting a dollar symbol in front of a lot of cultures. So of course, too, I mean, we were bringing up the topic of cultural appropriation, both within the African American community and the Indigenous community. And it's a lot of folks who love to wear beautiful, like, just again, you can play Indian per se, or you can act like the Black woman, or like all these different things that now it's just so culturally acceptable to, like, even with African American vernacular, our way of speaking. So it's like seen as the cool thing to do, but then it's just like, okay, all the Black folks who speak in that way, in their natural tongue, and as you can say, how many actually didn't get hired for a job because of that? How many folks actually have had disadvantages in their livelihood and personal self journey based upon systems that really look at that? Again, anti-Blackness, that's an ugly system where all Black culture is not seen as something to be celebrated, and something that again is really looking at as inferior in comparison to whiteness. But now you have this whole wave of white people and even people outside of Black cultures that they can embody these things that's seen as cool and trendy and sexy because it's really it's gimmicky. It's the really like just the parts of our culture that was really able to be, I guess you can say, not dumbed down. A lot of beautiful parts of our culture has been it's just been taken. It's been stripped. It's been extracted, let alone put dollar symbols in front of. And then that works for Indigenous communities where you have like the dream catchers and you have folks. I mean, in my side of Santa Clara, we've had a really, really, really disgusting history with literally like the Boy Scouts of America was taking our sacred dances, our ceremonies, like our cosas, our traditional people that we did beautiful ceremonies for. They were actually replicating those, and we actually had to get really deep. Had to form ways of protection because with intellectual cultural property. So, one moment, sorry about that. Let's see, where am I at? Oh, there we go. But yeah, just really keeping what is sacred within our own hands. And that is a way of setting these boundaries and really putting these that we can say that that's all right, that some people outside of that culture should not have their hands on it. That let alone, not only is it for sale, it's not for profit, but at the same time also respecting those boundaries that some things are not for certain folks who are not outside of that culture. I mean, who are outside of that culture. So like, again, like in this beautiful safe space where we're able to talk about anti-Blackness and colorism and all these different complexities which exist within Indigenous spaces, which exist within people of color without Black experiences. Setting the record, do not say the N-word. Like, that's just one thing, just to set that straight. So many different folks, you see that where it's just like, I'm sorry, that's just that's something that's in the same lines of code switching or whichever way that we have reclaimed that word. That's just for something that's only just for Black people. In the same way too, that Indigenous folks, we have some things even within our own specific tribes and within our own community spaces. Some things are just meant for Black people, and I mean Indigenous people, and it's really respecting those boundaries and putting those beautiful lines where we can say like, this is something of our own and we have a right to celebrate those. So it's that protection, it's that embodiment of what is sacred of ours, which has been taken from us time and time and time again, and not going forward with that pattern any longer, where we give respect and we hold the voices up of people whose culture that is, and just listen to them. If they're like, nah, I don't use that, or nah, that's just for us, then just having that respect and understanding those boundaries and just respecting these boundaries. That's a really good way just to start. If things are kind of feeling a little uneasy about cultural appropriation, just look to the guidance of people who embody those cultures.
That's great. That makes perfect sense too. I also want to thank Karmiela White. She was supposed to be here today, but she was ill. So we're sending her positive healing energy, hoping she gets well soon. I've learned so much from listening to both of you today. I also want to thank Irene for being a part of this dialogue. Thank you to everyone at home for listening to the discussion tonight. I hope it spurs dialogue in your own homes, maybe over coffee, maybe over tea, maybe over lemonade, whatever you prefer to have these types of discussions over. At our house, it's usually when both of us sit down, it happens. But again, we want to thank you both for being here. Thank you so much, Leilani, for the wisdom, because there was a lot of things I didn't know, and I want to learn everything I can be. I can't consider myself a resident smartass if I don't know more than everyone. So again, and thank everyone for showing up tonight, listening to this. Happy Juneteenth. Please remember this day, what it's about, the importance of it, because this is the only country in the world where independence and freedom mean two totally different things. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you all for joining us, and happy Juneteenth, happy Father's Day again, and just wishing you all and all your loved ones wellness and beauty in these trying times. Just always remember to go back to your inner sources of strength, all of our ancestors, all the wisdom that we carry inherently.
Thank you.